I'm most grateful for the chance to participate. Part of my perspective is shaped by my experience in the last few years serving as a non-executive director with the Competition and Markets Authority in the United Kingdom. And I'm not speaking for the CMA today, but I'm certainly going to draw on my experiences there in seeing how that authority has responded with an advocacy program. I'm going to talk about three elements for an effective program. One is drawing on a base of knowledge and data. The second is the importance of engagement with elected officials and the connection between the competition authority and the larger political world. And the third is thinking about the kinds of recommendations that might catch their attention in order to be effective. I think Fred already pointed to a general concern here. When Carl Shapiro gave his speech, in a sense, it was already too late to have a really effective role in shaping the policy process. The train had left the station, and Carl in many ways was describing the journey of previous trains, but the competition policy process in many ways had not gotten on that train. So how do you have an effect when it's most needed? The first, and I think everything I have to say in many ways will ring true to you based on your own experiences with advocacy. The first observation is that for any advocacy to be effective, especially in this environment, it has to draw on convincing knowledge, data, information. If the authority in any environment, especially now, steps forward and offers general observations about the benefits of competition, I believe it would be brushed aside as being naive and superficial. What is very important is to provide the kind of data context, in some ways replicas of Chiara's presentation that we just saw, which is I have numbers, I have a convincing base of experience from which I derive policy propositions. One thing that the CMA did, and fortunately had pre-positioned before the crisis took place, was the creation of a data team, not simply having a single data technologist, but to build an internal capacity to collect, examine, and evaluate data almost in real time. It meant that week by week, the CMA had and published information about consumer complaints, about specific phenomena in the marketplace that did two things. It enabled it to convince the larger world that it was certainly on the job and was focusing very carefully on current developments. But it also provided to a variety of policymakers useful, tangible information about what was taking place in the market. And my suggestion would be that over time, what one will see is that agencies have as part of their regular operations, but especially for crises, they have a similar capacity to examine, evaluate, and digest data and use that as a basis for making policy recommendations. Another crucial source of empirical observation is the stock taking from the agency's own experience. That is, in facing a crisis of this kind, an agency should have an intuition about which industries, which sectors are most vulnerable to structural change, and to draw upon that historical awareness in order to give specific observations about what is taking place in individual agencies, and I think quite important, to be in a position to offer a prognosis about where the competition policy hotspots will be in the future. Just yesterday, the CMA published a stock-taking report about competition in 2021. And although it does not have the most complete database, what the CMA sought to do is to say, here are the areas in which the economy faces great challenges going ahead. Here are our thoughts initially about what the priorities for policy development should be. Second thought, engagement. None of this works unless one has an ongoing conversation with elected officials and policy decision makers. A topic of discussion in this committee over the years has been, what's the appropriate relationship of the competition authority to the political process? And I think our general observation has been that if you depict yourself simply as a technologist working in isolation on specific scientific problems, you become an island that is easily bypassed at a time of crisis. So that this is the point at which an agency must draw upon all of its existing relationships with elected officials, formal and informal, but to build them as fast as they can if they don't exist. Because it is only by catching the ear of elected officials who are making these decisions and making them in horribly difficult circumstances. This is the stress test, the examination which they must pass immediately. And they don't want to be told, give me 6 months and I'll come back and give you some ideas about what to do. Their view is, I have to do things immediately in order to have real effects and to be seen by my public as being legitimate in my effort to respond to the crisis. So the second crucial ingredient of good advocacy is that continuing conversation, so that you are understood to be a constructive policy advisor, but also you have access to decision makers who are going to be spending the money and making the policy choices. Third, recommendations. Here is where the agency, based on its experience, has to set some priorities about where it can do the most good. For example, if you've been doing, as many of our agencies have, a lot of work with public procurement, that's a channel through which governments are already spending immense sums of money and will continue to. And the way in which that money is spent will have a decisive effect on how competition unfolds in specific sectors. There, the agency can have very good recommendations, I think, about how to spend it. Not necessarily to say that it has to be done in a particular way, but to say, here are the consequences of taking into account a broader array of policy concerns, including the value of competition in shaping the way individual sectors unfold. Second, subsidies. Agencies, again, are not going to be able to tell governments you cannot spend money. They must. But they can make suggestions about how to do it. Spend it with conditions that are related to the preservation of competition over time. Spend it in a way that preserves opportunities for this large ecology of small and medium enterprises to have ready, effective access to those subsidies. Spend the subsidies in a way that force decision makers as best they can to identify and anticipate what the configuration of the sector will look like in 6 or 12 months. A third area is a bit more selfish. That is, what kind of recommendations? Recommendations about how to improve the competition system. This has been a massive stress test for every agency. And in a stress test, you discover weaknesses, gaps in your own framework. This is the ideal time to step forward and say, we now have a real concrete understanding of what our weaknesses are. We have data to back that up. If you want us to work effectively in the future, this is what it will take in terms of authority, information gathering powers, sanctions. This is the opportunity to say, here's how we can build a better framework for the future. Thank you.